The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $70, and the biggest man on the salvage yard laughed at him. Thomas Kilroy did not laugh back. He just lowered his hand and looked at the thing he had bought. A 1962 Boston Harbor Masters official case. 42 pounds of dark leather over brass-cornered oak at the back of the Ashcroft Maritime surplus lot. Brass hinges. 2 heavy brass padlocks. Not standard Boston Harbor issue, but custom Yale padlocks, hand-fitted to the case's brass hasps. Stenciled across her front face. Boston Harbor Master, Pilot Station 3, South Boston. Burned into the leather corner. The FR brand of a working harbor master. Francis Regan. The harbor master of the Port Boston had classified as a defector during the Cuban Missile Crisis mobilization of October 1962. It was a Saturday morning, the 10th of August, 1985, 23 years after Francis Regan walked off Pilot Station 3 and did not come back. The case sat at the end of the row, $50 chalked on her leather, but the padlocks on those hasps were the thing. A Boston Harbor Masters official case comes from the port with an integrated brass latch and a single port-issued key, and a man who stood at his father's marine engineer bench at the Boston Harbor Pilot Association at 14 and watched him fit brass hardware. For port officials through the 1930s did not need to squint to see that these 2 Yale padlocks were not port hardware. Someone had put them there afterward, by hand. Thomas Kilroy was 69, broad-shouldered, a little stooped, weathered face under a wool cap, canvas jacket with 40 summers of Boston Harbor salt in the fibers. Thomas was the last maritime instrument restorer between South Boston and Gloucester, the last man in Suffolk County who could look at a brass padlock and tell you the year it was fitted, the port it was fitted in, and often the hand that had turned the key. And he had just paid $70 for a case every man on the lot agreed was scrap. The man who laughed was Colin Ashcroft, Jr. Ashcroft ran Ashcroft Maritime Surplus, biggest Boston Harbor area reseller. Inherited off his father, the late Colin Ashcroft Sr., 51, embroidered maritime jacket, gleaming pickup at the yard gate, $70. Ashcroft called. 70 for a padlock port relic Kilroy? Came off a Cuban Missile Crisis defection case. Curio for your South Boston den. He got his laugh, then found the name. Look at him, boys. Old Pick just bought himself a Cold War ghost. He coined it on the gravel. It stuck to Thomas for the rest of the summer. Pick. The men laughed because Ashcroft laughed. Thomas said nothing. He had learned at his father's Pilot Association bench that brass does not answer to noise, and that the men who yell nobody wanted a defector's case are the men whose fathers signed the missing officer report. What none of them knew was that this case had been padlocked shut on October 25th, 1962, in the Pilot Station 3 office by Francis Regan himself, with the 2 Yale padlocks and the hand drill he kept in his locker, and that Thomas's own father, Patrick Kilroy, Boston Harbor Pilot Association Marine, engineer 1925 to 1968, had worked hand-in-hand with Francis Regan for 18 years across every commercial vessel operation on the inner harbor. But a harbor master about to defect during the Cuban Missile Crisis mobilization does not spend his last night on shore padlocking his own case with 2 Yale padlocks fitted through hand-drilled hasps. A working harbor master seals his case against the only kind of thief the Coast Guard cannot see: the port operations manager writing the cargo manifest before the container has been unloaded. By the end of this, you're going to know what really happened at Boston Harbor Pilot Station 3 in October 1962, and how a $70 padlock case told the truth about a harbor master frame for a Cuban Missile Crisis defection his own port operations manager was staging to cover cargo diversion fraud. Thomas had held his first brass tool at 14 in 1930 on a crate beside his father's bench at the Pilot Association Station House on Long Wharf. Patrick had signed on with the Pilot Association in 1925 as an Irish-American Marine engineer and worked 43 years, retiring in 1968. Patrick had a rule he repeated: any dockhand can turn a padlock key, Thomas. A Marine engineer reads the padlock body. Brass remembers its harbor master. especially the brass that was fitted by hand, because the man who did it was not planning on the port operations manager opening his case without him. Thomas had listened for 38 years. His father was gone by 1978. Thomas had run his own maritime instrument restoration shop out of a converted shipwright's shed on the South Boston waterfront for the 17 years since. He bought the case anyway. If you've ever known a quiet, working man who was called a defector when he wasn't, take 1 second and subscribe. He bought her because of the padlocks. Thomas had crouched at that case 10 minutes, penlight in his teeth, tracing every millimeter of the 2 Yale padlock bodies in the hand-drilled hasps. Not factory. A working harbor master had drilled these himself. Then he found, half hidden under 23 years of grime, the small FR brand burned into the leather corner, Francis Regan's own harbor master mark. Thomas put his thumb flat on the brand and stood there a long moment, then raised his hand. To Colin Ashcroft, Jr., the thing was $70 of Cold War leather. To Thomas, it was a signed statement in Yale brass by a working harbor master his own father had known for 18 years. 23 years old, addressed to whoever could still read a padlock body. He meant to answer it. It took a chain hoist to load the case onto the flatbed. Thomas drove the 3 miles home, with his hazards going. By Monday, men who had not been in Thomas's shop in years were stopping by on thin excuses. It'll open, Thomas said, by Wednesday. Pick was what they call him at the harbor diner. On Thursday night, Thomas pulled down his father's papers. He found the Marine Engineer's logbook, 1925 through 1968, harbor traffic, and private notes on the men Patrick had worked with. He sat under the shop light, turned the pages. October 20th, 1962. Francis came to the shop tonight. The Cuban Missile Crisis is on the front page. Ashcroft at Port Commercial Operations is running a cargo diversion scheme undercover mobilization, declaring successful commercial unloadings as security classified emergency reroute, keeping the material through his son's Ashcroft Maritime surplus. Francis has documented 14 months, 23 operations misreported, 8 harbor masters framed. Francis asked me for 2 Yale padlocks and a hand drill. I told him, brass and hardened steel, hold what paper cannot when the port operations manager is writing the paper, especially during a national mobilization when the Coast Guard is looking east instead of at the docks. Thomas closed the log in the shop light, stood in his back bay until dawn, understanding that whatever Francis had sealed inside that case on October 25th, 1962, had been waiting 23 years for the one man in South Boston who would recognize both the hand-drilled hasps and the FR brand on the leather. Patrick Kilroy's own son, Francis Regan, born South Boston 1911, third-generation Irish-American harbor family. Pilot Association 1936. Made pilot station 3 harbor master in 1949. 2 port commendations. 51 the fall he vanished. Married Bridget in 1944. 17-year-old son Sean. Sean, what Boston never understood was port commercial operations. Colin Ashcroft Sr. was Port of Boston Commercial Operations Manager 1958 to 1968 until Army Corps of Engineers Investigations forced his retirement. He held authority to file cargo manifest completion reports and Coast Guard security classifications for commercial vessel operations. Between 1960 and 1962, he figured out something the Corps of Engineers would not catch until 1968. Commercial cargo could be classified as security-sensitive emergency reroute without third-party inventory, particularly during federal defense mobilizations. The Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962, was the mobilization he used. Between 1960 and October 1962, he misreported 23 Boston harbor commercial operations. Real cargo, $280,000. Recover material resold through Ashcroft Maritime surplus within 18 to 30 months. When manifest didn't match, he attributed discrepancies to individual pilot station harbor masters. 8 harbor masters by October 1962. Framed by paperwork. Francis caught it in August 1961. Because Francis filed his own independent cargo log for every commercial vessel crossing Pilot Station 3. 14 months of documentation. 23 misreported operations. Real cargo weights logged at unloading. Coast Guard emergency reroute filings that did not match the manifest coming off the docks. 8 frame harbor masters. Sullivan at Charlestown. Fitzgerald at East Boston. Regan at South Boston. O'Malley at Quincy. Cepatelli at Chelsea, Marchetti at Everett, Cavallero at Revere, Papadopoulos at Winthrop. Francis knew 6 personally. Boston Harbor working men. Irish, Italian, Greek immigrant families. Careers ended by a cargo discrepancy they had never signed for. He had photostat Ashcroft Sr.'s handwritten Coast Guard filings one Wednesday afternoon at Port Commercial Operations during a routine cargo review. Physics does not lie. A container either weighs what the manifest says, or it does not. Ashcroft Sr. did not intend to let October close on that. On Monday, October 22, 1962, the same evening President Kennedy addressed the nation on the Cuban Missile Crisis, Ashcroft filed the Coast Guard emergency report on 23 previously misreported commercial cargo operations. Under the cover of national mobilization, he declared all 23 security classified emergency reroutes. Personnel review pending. Named Pilot Station 3 Harbor Master Francis Regan as the officer of record whose cargo signatures had authorized the misclassifications. Francis had 72 hours before Coast Guard security review. That Thursday night, October 25th, in the Pilot Station 3 office on the South Boston waterfront, where his own case had unlocked and the 2 Yale padlocks and hand drill he had bought that morning lay ready. Francis Regan did his last honest work as a harbor master of the Boston Harbor Pilot Association. Into the case he placed his 14-month cargo cross-check log, 23 photostat Ashcroft emergency reroute filings, Ashcroft Maritime surplus sales records matched to the operation dates, Patrick Kilroy's Pilot Association log entries, the 8 frame harbor masters' names, $3,200 in banded cash in an oilcloth wrapper. This was for Sean's college. Ashcroft is going to take my station, and my name too. Give it to Bridget. Tell her Sean goes to college. Beside the cash, Francis's last week's pay, folded, and 1 folded page in pencil. Then Francis hand-drilled the case's brass hasps to accept the 2 Yale padlocks, fitted them, closed each with the Yale keys, and dropped both keys into the flame of the office stove, heated a small branding iron, set the FR into the leather corner. Then Francis went home to Bridget and Sean. The next morning, October 26, 1962, he did not report to Pilot Station 3. Port Commercial Operations classified him. Officer failed to report during national mobilization. Presumed defected. By the following week, personal effects were recovered from the South Boston waterfront. Reclassified. Missing at sea. Case filed as personal effects. Sat in Ashcroft Maritime surplus inventory 23 years. The Port of Boston had its classification. Carried it 23 years. Harbor Master failed to report during national mobilization. Presumed defected, then presumed lost at sea. What kind of Irish-American Pilot Association man does that during a national emergency? Bridget stayed in South Boston. The parish community was her whole life, but the Reagan name carried a shadow. By 1985, she was 68, retired from 28 years of teaching. Sean grew up inside the word defector. He turned 18 in November after his father vanished. In December 1962, he enrolled at Northeastern in civil engineering, deliberately, publicly, because his father had told him once that harbor infrastructure was federal jurisdiction under the Army Corps of Engineers, and Sean intended to work inside the Corps until a record was corrected. By 1985, at 40, Sean Regan was a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers regulatory officer at the Boston District Office, working commercial harbor cargo diversion cases across New England. 23 years he had waited, knowing his father had sealed something. only knowing Francis did not defect. Thomas did not rush the case. For 2 evenings, he studied the 2 Yale padlocks under raking light. No bolt cutter. Cured brass would ring the harbor. No pry bar. The leather over oak would tear before the hasps let go. What he could use was what his father had taught him at 14. A hand drill with a hardened 3/16 bit and a set of lock picks. On the 3rd evening, Thomas did the work. He mounted the case under the raking shop light, marked the 2 keyways with chalk. First padlock, the drill. He set the 3/16 bit against the keyway pin tumblers at 800 RPM. The bit through the first pin tumbler in 40 seconds. 5 brass pins in the Yale body, all drilled through in 3 minutes. The shackle sprung free with a small brass snap. Second padlock, the picks. Now that Thomas had seen how the first Yale was constructed, he set a tension wrench in the second keyway and worked a small pick against each pin tumbler in sequence. 5 pins, 6 minutes. The second shackle sprung. Then the case's brass latch. Spring mechanism. No key needed once the padlocks were off. Thomas thumbed it. At 9:30, the Harbor Master's case that no one had opened since October 25th, 1962, came open in Thomas's gloved hands. He set the picks down, pulled off his gloves, put on his reading glasses, reached in. The first was paper, wrapped in oilcloth. Francis's 14-month cargo cross-check log. Every real container weight logged at unloading. Every Coast Guard emergency reroute. Filing photostat in Ashcroft Sr.'s own hand. Ashcroft Maritime surplus sales records matched to the operation dates. Patrick's Pilot Association log corroborating every meeting. The 8 framed harbor masters' names. The second thing was money. 3,200 banded in oilcloth. A working man's 1962 savings. Beside it, Francis's last week's pay folded untouched. The third thing was a letter. 1 page, folded twice, in a harbor master's small deliberate hand, sealed in an envelope that said, in pencil, only in pencil, to the marine engineer's son who still reads a padlocked body. Thomas Kilroy, 69, alone in his shop before 10 with his father's Pilot Association log on the bench beside him, put on his reading glasses, and read a vanished harbor master's last honest words. If you are reading this, then you did what nobody at Port Boston Commercial Operations could do since I left the station. My name is Francis Regan, Boston Harbor Master, Pilot Station 3, South Boston. By the time you read this, Ashcroft at Port Commercial Operations will have told the port I failed to report during Cuban Missile Crisis mobilization. He will call me a defector. I did not defect. I stayed at my station. Your father, Patrick Kilroy, showed me how a harbor master hides truth in brass and Yale steel, where 2 padlocks and a hand-drilled hasp last 100 years. Everything about the 23 cargo operations Ashcroft has misreported through his son's Ashcroft Maritime surplus is inside. My wife is Bridget. My son is Sean. He is 17. Tell him our name is clean. And tell the 8 other Boston Harbor Pilot Station harbor masters. Sullivan at Charlestown, Fitzgerald at East Boston, O'Malley at Quincy, Cepatelli at Chelsea, Marchetti at Everett, Cavallero at Revere, Papadopoulos at Winthrop, and this one, your cargo discrepancies were never your discrepancies. They were his. A harbor master reads a cargo manifest, even when the operations manager wants him to sign the arrival receipt, without asking what's really in the containers. Thomas read it through twice, folded it back, and sat a long while in the quiet. At 9 Monday morning, Thomas carried a log, the 23 Coast Guard filings, the Ashcroft sales records, the 8 harbor masters' names, the cash, and the letter, along with his father's Pilot Association log, into the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Boston District Office. Set it on the regulatory officer's desk. The regulatory officer was Sean Regan. Thomas had not known. He had asked for the senior regulatory officer. He said only this was Francis Regan's. He sealed it himself. The Port Commercial Operations Manager was a thief, and 8 Boston Harbor Pilot Station harbor masters did not deserve to lose their names. Then he set the letter on top. Sean Regan read the envelope inscription in pencil, set his coffee down, opened the letter with his hands, very still, read it through once, then again, closed the folder, did not speak for a long time. Then he looked up at Thomas and said, very quietly, I have been waiting 23 years for someone to open my father's case. I knew he sealed it. I knew somewhere it existed. I never expected to see the day. The log was exact. The filings were Ashcroft Sr.'s own hand. The 8-frame harbor master's port records were on file with the Pilot Association archive. Patrick's log gave the harbor work the old Irishman's word. Colin Ashcroft Sr. had been dead 13 years, but the record was not. It was corrected publicly. In the Boston Globe, in a joint press release from the Army Corps of Engineers Boston District and the Massachusetts U.S. Attorney, on the same front page where the defection classification had lived since 1962. Francis Regan's record reclassified. Defection status vacated. Harbor Master's commendation reaffirmed posthumously. The 8-frame harbor masters, Sullivan, Fitzgerald, Regan, O'Malley, Cepatelli, Marchetti, Cavallero, Papadopoulos, all cleared. 2 of the 8 had died between 1963 and 1970. 6 living men received clearance letters. 2 families received them posthumously. The federal investigation turned to Ashcroft Maritime surplus and found Colin Jr. had been trading unauthorized maritime hardware for over a decade. Federally indicted inside the month. Federal receivership. Thomas found Bridget Regan in the parish house near St. Bridget's. Sean had come across town from the Corps of Engineers office and stood beside him. Bridget was 68. When Thomas put the letter in her hands, she read it once, slowly, stopping at the line about Sean. Then she looked past Thomas to her son, a tall, quiet 40-year-old in a Corps officer's suit with Francis Regan steady eyes, and handed him the letter. Sean read it standing on the porch. Once, then again, sat down, did not speak for a long time. Then he looked at his mother and said, very quietly, Ma, I waited 23 years for this. He knew I would. Bridget answered softly, Sean, he knew you would go into the Corps of Engineers a day. He sealed the case. He was not lost. He was waiting. Thomas nodded, stepped off the porch, drove back to his shop in the gathering dusk. Colin Jr. heard it the way everybody heard it. The surplus dealer who had coin-picked said very little afterward. He had stood 8 feet from that case and seen nothing but a Cold War relic, because Ashcroft priced scrap and Thomas read padlock bodies. Thomas made the harbor master's case right. Polished, the 2 drilled and picked Yale padlocks replaced with 2 new brass padlocks on the same hand-drilled hasps. His own TK brand cold burn beside Francis's FR, lid mounted open on brass hinges. Placed at the USS Constitution Museum at the Charlestown Navy Yard. Real U.S. Maritime Museum on Boston Harbor. Beside her, on a bronze plaque, Francis Regan, Boston Harbor Master, Pilot Station 3, South Boston, 1936 to 1962. He didn't defect. He read the cargo manifest. Beside that, Patrick Kilroy, Boston Harbor Pilot Association Marine, engineer 1925 to 1968, whose 1962 logbook helped clear a good harbor master 23 years later. And 8 smaller plaques, Sullivan, Fitzgerald, O'Malley, Cepatelli, Marchetti, Cavallero, Papadopoulos, and Regan, carrying the words of Port of Boston, had denied their families. Thomas Kilroy went back to his shop and went on restoring the maritime instruments the world had given up on. On a warm evening late that summer, light going gold across Boston Harbor, Thomas walked over to the Constitution Museum to look at the case one more time. 70 now. He stood at the display with his cap in his hands, rested his palm on the polished leather, in line with the Fr. Francis had branded 23 years before. He looked at the plaques for Regan and Kilroy, and the 8 for the frame harbor masters, and thought once about his father, and once about a South Boston harbor master alone at Pilot Station 3 in the small hours of October 25th, 1962, while President Kennedy addressed the nation about missiles in Cuba. Then he put his cap back on, walked home. So I'll leave you the way Francis left it, waiting on whoever had the patience. If you put a pen light on those 2 custom Yale padlocks and the FR brand on a $70 Boston Harbor Masters case at a South Boston lot, would you have paid the $70 and trusted a vanished Harbor Masters padlock leather to be worth 2 hours at a hand drill and picks? Or would you have laughed along with the loud man in the Maritime jacket and let 8 Boston Harbor Pilot Station Harbor Masters families keep believing their fathers were Cold War defectors for good?